Good morning, St. Mark's, our members, and any friends who may be joining in with us electronically, either right now or a little later. We, as I have said any number of times, want these to be inspirational and instructional, and we get feedback that suggests that they are, so we're going to keep them up to some extent. We're going to have a lag here after today of at least several weeks, but we'll get back to it. And again, give us feedback. Let us know who or what subjects or whatever you'd like to hear about or hear from, and I would be glad to see if we could arrange that kind of thing. Today we're joined by Pastor Jason Churchill, who is the pastor at St. Stephen's Lutheran Church in the city. I was the interim pastor there in 2010 and 11, I believe. And there was a pastor in between myself and Jason. But I still carry an affection for and an interest in and a hope for the church in the city that got going in me at St. Stephen's. So, welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
What would you like to tell us about yourself just to get started?
Well, I have been now at St. Stephen's for almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in July that I've been here. It seems like some moments it seems just like yesterday. Other moments it seems a little bit longer than that, and I'm sure you could relate.
Sure.
In some of that. Originally, my husband and I are from Chicago, and went to seminary out there, lived out there. This is the longest I've lived away from the city, and we had no intention on accepting a call or anything outside of the Cook County radius of Illinois. And it was a 5-minute encounter with Bishop Wolfgang at the time. Very awkward, very strange. And he said, "I'll be in touch." And he ran out the door to catch an airplane. And then, a week later, we received a phone call, and we went through the whole process. And somehow the Holy Spirit brought us out to Delaware.
Gotcha.
And we have not looked back at all. We absolutely love being out here. But I'm sorry.
No. Just did you get your college education in seminary in the Chicago area?
I did. Yeah, I went to college in Elmhurst, which is about 30 minutes outside of the city. Mm-hmm. And I was a political science and geography major with the intent of being either a senator or governor from Illinois.
I majored in political science, and my hope had been the diplomatic corps, which in those days was completely fanciful because all the diplomats were sons of diplomats or Ivy League college graduates and so forth. But I could hope.
Well, you could hope. It's ironic you said that, because I was in college right around the era of, I think, this third or fourth governor to go to prison. So I assumed that I wouldn't do well. That's not an environment I would flourish in. And actually began to study to be a Foreign Service officer. My great aunt was a Foreign Service officer for over 30 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And she'll be 90 this year. So if you think on the math on that, that's a pretty big career for somebody her age to have been part of. And she was one of the last consul generals in Khartoum before we pulled out of diplomatic relations with the Sudan in that capacity. And like you said, very fanciful, stories of, almost being eaten by a tiger in India, or, learning to check for bombs under cars, because little things like that. And now it's so different. If you go in, you're guaranteed probably a Middle Eastern post, and it's much more dangerous. It's not so romanticized as it was. But ultimately, I ended up becoming a campaign consultant. I chose that over the teaching certificate that I received.
Oh, okay.
And I served for a good period of time as a campaign consultant for a U.S. Congresswoman in Illinois. Again, that was at the end of an era where politics began to take that negative, that really visceral turn.
Yeah.
So sort of the writing was on the wall, and if you followed everything along, you would have probably not been so surprised as to where we ended up. But at that time, it wasn't a life that was, it wasn't conducive to the call that I felt to ministry. I also grew up Roman Catholic, so I was struggling with, a call in the context of how I understood myself and how I felt God was talking with me. So it took a.
I like to say Roman Catholics are only Lutherans who speak Latin.
I always say, what's in good company? Martin Luther was a Roman Catholic too, so I mean,
Darn
there we
if
go.
he wasn't. So you went to seminary?
I did.
Catholic seminary?
No, I went to seminary. In high school or in college, I became Episcopalian. My only experience was with the LCMS, which your experience was with them as well. It was not a positive experience in my context there, and the Episcopal Church was right across the campus greens. So I ended up there, and I was Episcopalian up until the second year of seminary. My history professor was a Luther scholar, and I became very infatuated with Lutheran theology. And I was at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Seabury had already closed, or it ended its program for Masters of Divinity. So I guess it was good. The Holy Spirit was really walking along that entire pathway. But half my family is ELCA. My dad's side of the family are all French Lutheran.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So yeah, they trace their lineage back to the French Lutherans.
I will report this to you. I reported it before to people here. My great-grandfather was the first pastor of the then Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states to be ordained in this country.
Wow.
And out of his progeny came scores and scores of Lutheran pastors.
So your family tree has a pretty good lineage of Lutheran pastors on it.
Yeah, and that great-grandfather, interestingly enough, I'd like to think this is in my genes, was in 1857 or that basic era, the representative of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states at a conference at Gettysburg to speak about Lutheran unity. So my history has been a lot more, let me call it both ecumenical and interfaith than most in that context. So, all right, so you came to St. Stephen's 5 years ago, and that was your first parish experience?
It was, yes.
Okay.
Or it is.
Or has been your first parish experience. Talk to me about that. What has been at St. Stephen's kind of like? It's in the city. I know from my own experience that there's no off-street parking. You have to compete with Westminster for parking at certain times. And so yet there's a history there of incredible loyalty on the parts of some people, of course, who were willing to make the walk or do whatever else it took to get there.
The church, I think early on in my call interview, was already lamenting about the fact we did not have a parking lot. We need a parking lot. We need a parking lot. And but this is an urban setting. This is you call yourselves an urban church. You don't need a parking lot. Part of the urban experience is walking. If you don't walk the block of your church, if you're in a city, and look and pay attention to your neighborhood, you really don't know how to engage ministry. Then you're just a fortress on a corner with no knowledge of what's around you. But if you're forced to park a block or two away and walk and interact with people along the way and see the life of the city, both and I'm not just talking people life. You can look at the wildlife in the city. You can look at the plant life in the city. And you can look at the human life in the city, and you can gather all that in just a block. And as you do that, you sort of learn. This is where God put our church. This is where God has called us to be for this period of time in our history. When you don't do that, and you just become isolated and this box on a corner somewhere, it doesn't matter whether you have a parking lot or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even if you have a lot of people driving in, which I know they do, the church lives there.
Yeah.
And the church needs to be a neighbor there, and so forth. One of the things that excites me, by the way, is I remember the first priority of the vision that we put together was to move the church, certainly from Rodney Street to Broome. I hope that served you well, because it made no sense to me at all that offices were over there and so forth. And of course, that building was in Albatross, so that's since been sold. And we said we were going to change the entrances and so forth, but especially bringing a little color to that side. Mm-hmm. So anytime I'm down there, and as you know, my wife volunteers at the food pantry, not right now, but hopes to go back. I would sit up in the off the chapel there and look out the window every now and then, and people would be walking their dogs or their kids or just walking and not even look because it was just another gray stone facility, that didn't have any attraction, if you will. So color must have been helping, at least to acknowledge that St. Stephen's is there.
Yeah, one of our new initiatives is to bring more color, more presence of God's creation to the property. The 13th Street side is slated to become a small urban park where people can sit and enjoy lunch, enjoy a moment of just solitude. There's so many scripture stories of people sitting outside the windows and overhearing Paul teach and preach. So you pop those windows open, who knows who'll be outside listening to the service, listening to the organ or the piano, or just having a moment of just peace and relaxation, an opportunity to give to the community. So we're in process of bringing even more of that to the front of the church. But the interesting thing is, one of my early stories that I remember from one of my parishioners, she was telling me that she moved here from PA and was looking for the Lutheran Church that was near her home. She lived at Lincoln Towers. Uh-huh. So that's the other set of senior living towers in Trolley Square on the other side. And she was walking up and down the street past our church, trying to find it. Could not see the sign, didn't see the doors, didn't notice the building. And when she did, she said, I didn't know which doors to go into. So this idea of being inviting, knowing which doors to enter into. I think historically, if you were coming to St. Stephen's, you knew what door to go into, you knew where you belonged, you knew where your place was. Mm-hmm. And that also was an era where your personhood was also defined by the church you belonged to. I'm so-and-so and I belong to this church. And sure. and that era we all know is long gone. We aren't identified by our church by and large in our country now, or even in the world now. So how else do you bring people in? How else do you invite people in? And one of the ways is COVID taught us an interesting lesson. Prior to my arrival at St. Stephen's, there was some disturbance with seeing, and I'll use quotes, those people that would visit the food pantry out front receiving produce or receiving their food. There was a very strong complaint from a neighbor nearby. And when I arrived, my first thought is, if we move the ministry out into public where people can see it, people will want to be part of it. And there was a resistance because the folks at the church did not want to get in trouble. They were scared of what the response could be. They weren't embarrassed. They weren't hiding anything. They were afraid of the neighbor. And we looked at the ordinances. We weren't breaking any laws. There was nothing being broken. So we slowly started to look at how we can begin to gain a human presence in front of the building. And COVID sped that along because, as you're aware, and if you all have a chance to visit, the pantry's small. I mean, it's probably not even half the size of your lobby here, where you would enter in to receive groceries. So there's no way you can social distance.
And yet it was designed as a food pantry.
It was designed as a food pantry with a much different volume in mind, I think. I think they were assuming maybe 100 or so families a month, and we push 1,100 families a month now. So that's just a capacity that's nearly, it's hard to comprehend.
Sure.
1,500 people, let alone families. That's one plus, others in there.
Sure.
But COVID brought us this interesting gift of having to be outside and bringing our typical ministry outside. Well, on top of that, the folks that lost their positions or were furloughed and not paid, so the need grew, and we would have lines sometimes all the way down to Denby Hall. There's an entrance off of Broome Street that one of our neighbor buildings has, and we would have a line of people down there. And I think I was having this anxiety of, oh no, my phone's going to start ringing, and it's going to be happening, and people are going to be complaining about seeing, quote, those people as my predecessor experienced. And we experienced the opposite. People were also home because they were working from home. So, when you work from home, of course, you'll take your dog for a walk around noon, or you'll try to get out of the building and just get some fresh air. They were curious about what was happening. We had to start turning volunteers away because we didn't have room for them. We did not know what else to give them to do. We had an increase in food donations and financial donations. There is a gentleman that will periodically hand $50 bills out to people in line as they're waiting, in hopes that that'll help with electric or bus pass or gas for getting the person to work or something. We discovered that when you are doing God's work in this public church setting, that's a great seminary catchphrase right now, public church. This is what public church is. It's being out in plain view. And I think that's a more powerful way of evangelizing than standing on the corner with the Bible preaching at someone.
One of the things that we contend with here, or I am trying to press here, is for people to think in all the aspects of our ministry, whether it's education or worship or whatever, missionally. And, that's a relatively new term, perhaps, but at the same time, not just what would satisfy us, but how does what we do meet and or speak to and or invite those from the outside to say, I'm intrigued by all that, let me take a look. And I think that's essentially what you're saying.
Yes. If your mission, once you discover your mission, doesn't align with the core values of, for example, St. Mark's, whatever the core values are of this community, they have to align with your mission for it to really begin to flourish. And then, you can stand the criticism of somebody saying those people shouldn't be in plain view. Well, you know how to answer that. You know how to live into the difficulties of that. But when there's a misalignment, you can't even give an elevator speech of who you are, let alone be able to answer challenges or questions. I would love to take all credit for that, but it isn't me. One of the wonderful things my predecessor did was to set the church up to look outward, to look out toward the community and not within the walls. I think the most, and I get to brag on this with still my seminary colleagues, that my letter of call says I need to be 80% outside of the parish doing community work, engaging our community partners in our mission outside of St. Stephen's. And there's so much life in that, in being able to do what I do with others that may not even know what a Lutheran is, but will begin to look at the church and say, oh, that's what they are. That's what a Lutheran does. And therein lies some great power. But we also began a process called LEAD with the Synod, living every day as disciples, L-E-A-D, yes. Living every day as disciples. And I was encouraged by Good Shepherd. Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd engaged the program a few years before we did. And out of their engagement, their community gardens became part of who they are. And the yield of those gardens come to the food pantry doors. I don't know when our two churches really talked seriously or engaged in ministry together. I was told, oh, that church was built so people didn't have to come to the city anymore. That was the way it was explained to me. I said, well, yeah, but look at the new partnership we built. That really is redefining the way in which we engage one another.
I believe what you're doing now in that regard is distinctive and wonderful. However, there had been an era around here where cooperation between the various Lutheran parishes especially was better. Now, that said, let me tell you a quick story. My wife and I were in Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh. But we were downtown. We stayed downtown and went to First Lutheran to church on Sunday morning. And one of the first things they said in their welcome was, we, First Lutheran and Westminster Presbyterian and Aldersgate Methodist, or whatever it was called, and Trinity Episcopal, and gosh, I think there was even a Baptist church, are committed to maintaining the sacramental presence of the Christian faith in the city. I was elated that Trinity Episcopal and St. Stephen's did the walk. I participated in half of that, at least. Talk to me, if you will, about that kind of cooperation in the city.
So I serve as Bishop Gold's ecumenical officer here in mainly the northern half of Delaware. And part of my joy in ministry is engaging ecumenical partners and working together. This came out of a very long conversation on how can we better relate between the two churches. We're not that far away. And realizing that we are very, very distant in the way in which we do ministry. There's a significant difference of the two ministerial styles of our churches. But our purpose in the city, our hope for the city, and our belief in Wilmington being more than it already is really well aligned. And we thought, how can we engage in our similarities and our hopes for the city and our laments for the issues in the city. And together we began to utilize a Palm Sunday service that the Lutheran Church has used a few years back up here, but being more intentional on using it as an educational piece for the two congregations, both in the way in which we were related, because there is a historical relationship to Trinity Episcopal Parish with the Lutheran Church. In fact, they are called by the Lutheran Church of the Old Swedes. So they have Lutheran in their title because of the historical connection. And we want to celebrate the fact that we are relearning this connection and trying to see what that looks like in our lives together. And in doing that, so we have that educational piece. We also have the lament piece of the gun violence. One of their parishioners was gunned down not too far from Trinity, maybe
we walked
2
past
blocks.
that place.
We did, yeah.
Jason, let me just interrupt one point. I know the Old Swedes Trinity history, but some of the people who may be listening to us do not know the connection. In
the 1600s, the Swedes had a colony set out here, and in that they brought their faith and their pastor and their religion, and it was Lutheran. My heritage is actually Swedish Lutheran in my formation. Which was its own beast of Lutheranism. But so they set that up, and it was after, I don't remember what caused the Swedes to pull out of the colony, but they basically handed the keys over to the Anglican to the Anglican Church, and it became sort of watched over by the Episcopal Church, or it was the Anglican Church at the time when they.
That's been a long time back.
Oh, sure, it was the 16, well before the. Yeah.
I guess I'd heard, and whether this is accurate or not, I don't remember or know, that it had something to do with the availability of clergy.
Yes, there was a story that the clergy would come out once a month or something, and there's graves that people don't really know where somebody's buried because there wasn't a clergy person there to record the funeral. They would just have to bury the person because they couldn't wait for the priest to come. So, it was a real difficult time, and that wasn't uncommon for a lot of the early colonial churches here to not have a pastor there that was always dedicated to them. We see it on TV, and it's really cutesy in the little church in the little town. But in reality, particularly for many of the Protestant faiths, the pastors would make kind of a circuit. And they would have a region, and if you saw your pastor once a month, you were pretty lucky. And that became difficult as well. I don't believe there were many Swedish pastors out here at the time, so there was already a limit on availability to the Lutheran clergy, and then that same happened for the Anglican clergy at the time. So there was this disconnect very different than now, where our pastors and churches are. Well, you're going through a call process now. I'm sure the call committee wouldn't want to see their next pastor once in a while. I think they would like to.
Well,
see them
although
often.
that's for a number of different reasons getting harder and harder to
It is.
pull off.
It is.
So, what about the two questions? What about the other churches in the city, First Central Pres and Grace Methodist, etc.?
So one of our new and growing relationships is actually with Holy City, the Swedenborgian Church, which is just across the corner from us. We have a fair number of their members as volunteers in the pantry. Pastor Shada is very part-time, but when she is here, we are engaging in creation care projects together. And there's I don't want to really give the history on this because I don't know it very well, but I know there's a connection. I think Swedenborg was a Lutheran pastor before.
Swedenborg was a Lutheran pastor's son.
Okay, see, there you go.
The pastor who had been there for 40 years is a friend of mine.
Okay, yeah.
Long before I was at St. Stephen's, we know each other.
Their approach to ministry is different, but their approach to creation care is really in line with what our synod is really growing and learning about, particularly with Deacon Laura in our creation care ministry. And so that's a new partnership, which is
But your
incredible.
neighbors,
Yep.
whatever the excuses were
Yeah.
historically not to get along
Yeah,
or
it's
to have
changing.
anything to do with each other, to recognize that, gosh, we live in the same region, care about the same things.
We do more than just share a parking lot every so often with Westminster.
Sure,
we
I know
are
that.
in we're in conversation, and we do talk often with the staff and clergy there, which is a nice relationship. We do interact with Hanover Presbyterian, and at the same time, we also kind of stretch over interfaith lines, and Rabbi Michael and St. Stephen's are beginning to build a project together.
At Beth Shalom.
Beth Shalom. So it is nice to have conversations as opposed to being at odds with one another. I don't think any of the old fears are relevant anymore. We're all experiencing decline. No one's going to steal from another. But together we're seeing how projects like the walk actually can be transformative for people. We see how a relationship with a neighbor in trying to restore native plants to the area is actually a bigger message than just, I'm this kind of Christian and you're that kind of Christian. And well, together we serve Christ, and there are probably more similarities than differences.
Well, speaking of necessity as the mother of invention, as you know, I have a passion for the Christian church in the Holy Land, and one of the benefits, I say that very cautiously, of the decline in the Christian population has been, I think calling it a healing would be going too far, but a new level of cooperation between Eastern and Western Rite Catholics in the Middle East, between them and the rest of the Anglicans and the Lutherans, and so forth. So to be able to cooperate instead of compete has to be God-pleasing. It just has to be God-pleasing. The other question, similar one, is I was very involved in the National Conference of Christians and Jews local region for decades. Actually, the Clergy Fellowship began to meet at Concordia after a while. We used to be at Beth Shalom. I don't remember why we moved it, but that's beside the point. One of the things that we wanted to do was to relate more positively and more regularly with the Black community. And there were all kinds of reasons why that couldn't happen. Though I think both sides would like for it to have happened, it couldn't. A lot of the Black clergy work and are not full-time. Not all of them, of course, because there's some pretty big Black churches in the city. But is there anything going on new there?
So through the Creation Care Project, we're beginning to engage, hoping to engage Mother African. I always say it's a selfish reason because they're right across the street from me, and it'd be great to see more gardens. But it's also within that neighborhood area, and they serve their neighborhood. So within that creation care process, we're looking at engaging them. But there's a more serious engagement happening through the Christian Council of Delaware, which mainly right now is the ecumenical officer for the United Methodist Church, the canon to the ordinary and ecumenical officer for the Episcopal Church, and then myself. So Martha Kirkpatrick is the Episcopal priest on board. Bob Hall, Reverend Bob Hall.
I know Bob very well.
Is our Methodist colleague. The three of us are trying to begin to reimagine this Christian council, which was very limited to just certain ecumenical bodies, to begin opening up into the question of how do we engage our clergy of African descent? How do we engage the Black churches of Wilmington? It isn't enough to just show up to a Black Lives Matter march. There has to be a deeper engagement with the community. There has to be more conversation, more relationship building. I think what we're looking at is how do we begin to build relationship with our clergy colleagues, and to recognize the dynamics and the differences, but also the same similarities. The laments we had on that walk are definitely the same, probably laments and shared laments of our colleagues that are in other parts of the city that are in.
Oh, I would think so.
Yeah.
Cornell West was the featured speaker at an event that was sponsored by the News Journal 20 years ago, and spoke to the issue that it would seem like, whether in Wilmington or in a broader sense, there was a work-life, I know the DuPont company had worked on that, coming together of the racial disparities and housing, but there was no sociability, and there was just very little of that, and I don't know that that's changed much.
I still think Sundays are. I can't recall who said Sundays are the most segregated days.
Tony Campolo, I think it was, who said that.
I don't think much has changed, and I know the Lutheran Church is painfully white in so many ways, but we can't really change that until we begin actually looking at and building relationships with others and serving our communities, and asking the question, who's missing from this room, who's missing, whose voice is missing from the dialogue, and where do we go from there? What does that mean? We have to be intentional, and I think it is social and relational. Well,
and take some risks, there's no question.
Yeah.
Look, you mentioned your husband.
Yes.
In a little bit of time we have left, what might you be able to share with our listeners that would be helpful for them in perhaps being more open or accepting of the ministries of gay pastors? Maybe that's not to put it like I wanted to put it, but it gets at it somehow.
Sure. I think understanding that when an individual is living fully into the person in whom God created them to be is the first and foremost thing you want to do. And I think that the most difficult time for me when I was closeted is I was not living into the person God made me to be. Once I was able to become more confident and had a community of people that reassured me that it was safe to be who I was, I began to grow into my person, into the person I was created and made to be. So one step is to be open to people of LGBTQ, AI, whatever letter you have on the spectrum, to be open to embracing them, to understanding that they are just trying to live into the person God made them to be. And in so doing, you're going to end up having stronger relationships. You're going to have a much more confident person actually fulfilling their purpose or their call into whatever the world's calling them to be. And to understand that all really anybody wants to do is to be accepted and loved. And really when it comes down to that, is that not what Jesus taught us, was to love one another, just as he loved us. And he did not put a lot of stipulations on what love means and what love is. Mm-hmm. He loved people that were unlovable at the time.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely. There would be those, and I don't know here. We really haven't had that conversation, to be quite frank.
mhm,
But who would argue, because of their own entrenchment or histories or whatever,
mhm.
that God didn't make you like He intended you to be. Um, how do you combat that, or do you?
It's combating that's a little difficult sometimes if they've already shut down and aren't listening.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is to just live as yourself. One of the that was a difficulty for some folks at St. Stephen's. We did lose 2 members because of my call, but we gained nearly a dozen more. So there is embracing by and large of folks. I think living as you are as a person. There was a person at the church that was not sure yet, and of whether gay people were God's people or not. And there was an event going on, and Craig and I were bickering about something, just as a normal married couple would. And she came from around the corner with a big grin on her face, and she says, "Oh, I see. You're just like me and my husband," and smiled and walked away.
Okay. There was a member there who, because of my relationship with this person, when I was the interim pastor there, who came to me with issues about it. And I am glad to know that they came back. However, that said, one of the things that I've done historically in my confirmation instruction is, after all the catechetical stuff is done, and I believe, by the way, in the catechetical stuff, I have moral issues, ethical issues, and I do citizenship and prejudice and human sexuality and those kinds of things. When they're a little older, and maybe not quite old enough, but older than when confirmation starts, to try to handle some of that stuff. And one of the things I try to teach is that any one adjective by which you describe somebody is pure prejudice. That, black people are not just black, and that tall people are not just tall, and the gay people aren't just gay, and straight people aren't just straight, and so forth. And I think this gets at what you're saying, is we've got to allow people to be who they are, and not just what we think they are.
It's exactly right. That is exactly right. To be who you are. I mean, I know that I'm okay being able to be my sort of flighty self at times at St. Stephen's, because they've accepted and actually I think it's now expected that that's who I am, and to be who I am instead of trying to always be on point and
Okay.
everything's perfect. That's part of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a gay part or a straight part it's just part of who I am. And to recognize that and to live into that is really important. I'm always wondering if one of the greatest sins we commit against God's creation is not living into who we are. And sometimes we don't know who we are, and sometimes society is trying to teach us that that's wrong, or to push that back, or not to be that. And I think we're really doing a disservice to God in that. We are all the same dust, and we're all going back to the dust in the same way. We share a very, very basic human relationship. And I think that's incredibly important. And the church has excluded people, I think, over the last 2,000 years better than it has included people. We've become masters of excluding for one reason or another. And when we stop doing that, when we start opening our doors and our hearts and our minds to all the possibilities, that the Holy Spirit really has a lot of leeway then in our lives. And when that happens, you see transformation in ways that are just incredible and holy.
I've told this story before here, so I don't mean to be redundant, but it's pertinent. My wife and I went to, our son's in Seattle, and we went to Yosemite Lutheran Church at 8th and Spruce, 8th and Stewart, and in Seattle, 8 blocks from the Pike Street Market where you see fish being thrown and so forth. And the person who gave us our bulletin was homeless. There was simply no diversity excluded in that community. And the sermon was wonderful. Both pastors were gay women. The worship was spirited and so forth. And it wasn't like we were pressed to have this conversation, but in our walk down to the Pike Street Market, we engaged in an academic exercise of who would Jesus have excluded? And when you get into that crazy question, what you end up with is you. After you're done excluding everybody you don't think belongs, you're going to. Yeah. So better the other way around. And maybe we're learning those things, Jason. I hope so. Look, thanks for coming. And this doesn't mean you can't come again. There can be things come up in the world or in the community or whatever in our lives that will occasion coming back. We'd love to have you. I don't know if my permanent successor will keep this up. We'll see.
It'd be a wonderful way for us and whomever that is to meet.
Oh, absolutely.
That'd be a wonderful
opportunity. Sure.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, sir. And we will be off again for a number of weeks. Gigi and I are going on vacation, and then I don't have anything arranged when we first come back, but we'll get back at this as we have occasion. Speak to me. Let me know what you want to hear about. Have a good week. We'll see you later.